Good morning, everyone. I have a confession to make. I am not a real estate professional, which makes my task today, following on from my esteemed panelists, and keeping you all awake for what has been a long morning, I'm sure, all the more challenging, but I'll give it a go. I think the first thing, let me just test this here. The first, a couple of, why am I here then? In the context of the Investment Horizons theme today, I wanted to spend some time talking about what changes we are seeing in the energy landscape, how that might impact landlords and property developers, and indeed what funding solutions we have developed to help that transition for property owners. A few words of introduction about the Green Investment Group. We actually started life as the Green Investment Bank, a government-owned and funded institution set up in October 2012. Our headquarters are next door in Atria 1. The sort of bumper sticker mission statement read, we're here to help the UK's transition to a low-carbon economy. Last year, the government decided to sell the business and privatise it. We were sold to the Australian financial institution Macquarie. As part of the Macquarie Group, whom some of you may have come across, they are one of the largest infrastructure asset managers and a leading infrastructure M&A advisor. The acquisition represents a strategic shift towards capitalizing on what is probably one of the fastest growing sectors or subsectors in the infrastructure space, namely the green infrastructure area. The GIG, as we're now known, has become Macquarie's platform for all of its principal investing in green infrastructure. We do this on a global basis now. To give you a sense of some of the things that we have done, and these stats are a combination of the legacy Green Investment Bank as well as Macquarie's own activities, just to pick out a few of those. The first one, which you may, well, very few people know, but we've invested or been involved with in some way, shape or form in close to half of the offshore wind capacity in the UK. In addition to that, we have a thriving a business in owning and leasing out smart meters to all the utilities in the UK. And then finally, the point on the top right-hand side, which is relevant for some of the corporates, and I'll come on to that later. We developed and funded and are constructing, as we speak, the largest onshore wind farm in Europe, in Sweden, a 650 megawatt wind farm that is essentially unsubsidized and backed by a corporate power purchase agreement, to use the terminology that Colin alluded to earlier. And we're selling the power from that to an aluminium smelter in Norway, Norsk Hydro. Now, with that, what are we seeing in the energy markets? You may all have seen a version of this in the past. Essentially, the main shift that we are seeing is from what was a very much command and control, centralized energy system with large-scale energy generation dotted around the country, and then imagine someone at the controls pulling levers at National Grid, sending power in various different ways. That is really shifting towards this proverbial decentralized energy model, where generation of power and indeed flexibility are a lot closer to the end consumers, the corporates that are out there, but even at residential level. What that means in practice is an increased complexity, both in terms of technology evolution, as well as regulatory changes, which just creates what is an increasingly complex picture. We do, however, think that for landlords and tenants alike, that does represent a significant opportunity. So what does that mean in practice? And this is probably the bit where I'm going to stray into and hopefully help address you as either real estate professionals or people interested in the sector. How does that affect property owners and developers? I think the first area is regulation. You may all be aware of the various energy efficiency directives that have emanated from Brussels, or indeed local legislation around the energy performance in buildings, which has led in the UK to these minimum energy efficiency standards for England and Wales in particular, but Scotland have actually just when we were at All Energy with Shepherd and Wedderburn, Nicola Sturgeon announced the energy efficiency strategy for Scotland as well. So those minimum energy efficiency standards have come into force this year. They only apply to renewal of leases, but from 2023 it'll apply across the board, and buildings with a so-called energy performance certificate of E or below, well, it's actually below E, will not be able to get renewed. So there is a real life impact on landlords when it comes to the energy and the energy efficiency space in particular. The areas where that really hits you directly that means an investment in upgrades. Now, some of the investments in, say, LED lights, may be quite a quick payback, and maybe something you can do yourselves. But some of the more capex-intensive measures, upgrading HVAC, heating, ventilation, or indeed adding renewable generation capacity on site, may be beyond your own sort of investment appetite, and I'll come on to how I'm seeing a bifurcation in some of the investment models between the bricks and mortar and some of these energy assets. Another aspect is the change in that whole distributed energy landscape. Means a number of things. Colin helpfully put the chart up earlier about the increase in the retail electricity prices, and the large component of which are these non-commodity costs. We are seeing that continuing to grow, and those non-commodity costs, again, are there to contribute to the use of the system, so paying for the wires, paying for National Grid to balance the system, and indeed paying for the subsidies that go to a number of the renewable technologies in the first place. With that increase in electricity prices, there's also a real change in attitude that we can see in how tenants and our sort of corporate customers think about energy. It's no longer just a cost center. It very often is now viewed as something that can be actively managed, and indeed in many instances can generate revenue. And then finally, on what are some of the considerations of the shift to a distributed energy model, we're also seeing an increasingly important element in some of the tenants that you may deal with wanting to improve not just the CSR aspect, it's also just driving down costs. And you may have heard of a grouping of corporates called the RE100. There's 136 and growing companies, multinationals, that have signed up to source 100% of their energy needs from renewables, and it includes such names as IKEA, Apple, H&M, some of which may indeed be tenants of the landlords here. Now, practical implications for property owners and developers, and I'm really just going to some of the real nuts and bolts here. What we're finding is with either retrofits or indeed new buildings, and the first point about roof integrity, can it support rooftop solar? Whenever we look at buildings, we're finding that some of the logistics sheds, the old ones, may not actually be structured well enough to actually support that. The second point that is really practical is grid connections for buildings would typically have been construed as one way. So you're importing energy, and the reality is that in this decentralized world that is a lot more flexible, needs to be two-way. That's not beyond the wit of man, but it does require a bit of investment and dealing with the local DNOs. And then finally, the other practical implication of this for property owners is, in wanting to be more flexible, there are models of battery storage, but then what we're finding in our battery proposition to corporates is there's a real practical implication of space. These are 20 to 40 foot kind of containers. That's sort of what you need to have in mind when you think about a battery for a typically sized sort of about 1 megawatt, if that means anything to you, but that requires space. And we're spending quite a bit of time with food retailers in assessing how we can make their energy demand more flexible, putting batteries on site. So that's sort of the second element. And then finally, one of the big shifts that we're seeing is the whole aspect of e-mobility that Colin alluded to. Just earlier this week, Bloomberg New Energy Finance produced a report which I thought was quite interesting in comparing the projections for electric vehicle uptake across a number of different sources. So looking at the oil majors, the Exxons, the BPs, but also looking at the International Energy Agency, and they produce their own forecast. Now, one thing we all know for sure is that any of these forecasts are inevitably going to be wrong. But the interesting bit of the analysis was they tracked the changes in these forecasts over the years, and the IEA just since last year doubled its estimate of EV uptake by 2030. So one thing is for sure, and none of these reports disagree on this point, is that the adoption of electric vehicles is going to increase markedly over the coming years. And a tipping point seems to be in the early half of the 2020s when electric vehicles will reach cost parity on an unsubsidized basis with the internal combustion engine comparison. So again, so uptake is one element. One of the other areas is how will charging behavior change? I'm personally I don't have a very strong conviction as to where it'll be, home, or destination, but I think one thing is for sure is destination charging. By that I mean in retail environments, and office charging will be part of the solution. So again, implications for property owners and developers, it's really thinking about the absolute grid capacity on site. In chatting to one of my fellow panelists yesterday evening, the analogy here is really the size of the pipe that comes onto site. How much throughput can it bear in terms of the energy? And to give you a sense of how relevant this is, the typical food retailer superstore will have a grid capacity of anywhere between 1 megawatt and 1.5 megawatts. If you were to install about 10 so-called rapid chargers, and these are 50 kilowatt rapid chargers that can charge up a battery up to 80% within about half an hour, that would lead to effectively, so 10 times 50 kilowatts, that eats up anywhere between a third and a half of your existing grid capacity. So these are very real considerations, I think, for property owners and developers in thinking about currently, but also in how one could future-proof some of the investments. So if that's the impact on property owners, what we've done in recognizing some of these challenges is we've set out to create a dedicated team, and no prizes for originality in naming the team. Energy Solutions is what we came up with, but to essentially help corporates develop, fund and implement some of these energy infrastructure needs. The way we do that is by combining a technical and a financial approach in working with corporates. We find that that really helps to overcome some of the development hurdles. So it's not just someone selling a technical solution and then leaving the funding to the 11th hour to figure out how you do that. It really is a combined proposition. And the specific products that I'll highlight in a moment, and I think will hopefully be helpful in outlining how I think some of the property owners can help or can move in that energy transition. The two key products I wanted to highlight are the ones marked here A and B, which is our energy services agreement and our battery power purchase agreement. So with the energy services agreement, or the ESA, in essence, we invest in our clients' energy assets. We own it, and we enter into long-term so-called energy services agreements, and I'll come on to the next slide. We'll explain how it works in practice. These are not on our clients' balance sheets. This is a pure service agreement, and the idea here is that we invest in these assets that will generate a reduction in kilowatt hours, so an absolute reduction by investing in more efficient kit, but also in a reduction of the amount of electricity that is drawn from the grid. And so Colin's earlier point about that does generate significant savings. And out of those savings, we take our cut and we get paid for the negative kilowatt hours that are generated. So the next slide will illustrate that, hopefully. How do we do it in practice? We plan, we go in and do some desktop work with our technical partners to assess what the scope of the possible is. Then go into a phase which is a much more detailed design, and it's all akin to a development phase, and saying, okay, we think we can deliver this, now let's go into a detailed design, or what we call an investment grade audit, and ultimately implement this. The range of technologies is anything from all of the consuming assets on site, so anything from the LEDs through to motors and pumps and HVAC, all the way through to the generating assets on site, rooftop solar, combined heat and power. So all of that is covered under these energy services agreements. The practicality of it is as follows. These are illustrative numbers. So where previously a client of ours may be consuming 10 million kilowatt hours and paying 10p for each of those kilowatt hours, the idea is that we invest in those new assets, and in turn reducing their consumption by half. And because we made the investment in the kit, we will clearly look for a return. But as it happens, because those kilowatt hours that you're avoiding are indeed a lot cheaper than the ones that you're importing from the grid, we can charge a lower price for those negative kilowatt hours and enter into that long-term energy services agreement, or ESA, generating savings for our clients from day one. And again, I stress this is not on our clients' balance sheets, so it's very much a service agreement, and we only get paid if we generate those negative kilowatt hours. So our interests are fully aligned with our clients. Just pausing on where this is applicable to the property sector. We've mostly been working with clients on retrofitting buildings, so that's been the key focus. But we are also starting discussions, in particular with logistics developers, on how we can work hand in hand with logistic developers upfront in essentially bifurcating the investment between the bricks and mortar and the energy assets on site. We're finding that a lot of the tenants, the online retailers that were alluded to this morning, they either are signed up to the RE100 or have other CSR targets. And we're finding that they have requirements of the developers for rooftop solar, for the ability to have rooftop solar, for flexibility. And what we're therefore looking to do is to have almost a stapled energy services agreement upfront alongside the bricks and mortar. And what that does is it allows for, I think, a more efficient way of allocating capital to the specific areas that are of interest. In one case, it's property. In the other case, it's energy assets. That isn't just applicable to the logistics side. We're in early discussions around, on the residential side, helping deliver the district heating assets that may come into play there as well. So again, I think there is a real potential here for landlords and developers to look into these differing energy contractual arrangements alongside the more traditional bricks and mortar investments. Now, there are some challenges. I won't lie about that. These are mostly applicable to long leaseholds, and because there is that alignment required with tenants, so perhaps less applicable, for instance, with shopping centres where tenants may be less interested in entering into these long-term, locked-in ESAs or power purchase agreements. The next and final product on my side, which I want to just spend a minute on, and I'll come on to the applicability of this for the property sector as well, is our battery power purchase agreement. This essentially sees us investing in a battery, putting it on our client's site, and entering into, and we do all the upfront investment, the development of, and the negotiations with any distribution network operators for any changes in the grid aspect. So there's the development work, the investment work, and the ongoing maintenance is all ours. The agreement we look to enter into with our clients is an offtake of energy, of electricity from our battery during the peak hours of the day. So on the diagram at the bottom of the slide, the green bars there is essentially the client taking power from our battery. And the reason it's at that time, that happens to be the time when costs and those non-commodity costs are highest for corporates. And therefore, we're finding that we can offer that power purchase agreement, so for each unit of electricity at a significantly lower price than the counterfactual, in many instances up to 50% reduction compared to peak cost. I think where this is most applicable for perhaps the audience here today is where a significant portion of the energy is used in kind of common areas and can be recharged under a service payment. That may be applicable. There's a potential for a landlord to either keep some of those savings or over the longer term help reduce some of the service charges, which may make particular assets more attractive. So just finish on why some of these energy solutions, why we think it's slightly different from what perhaps we may have seen elsewhere. I'm convinced that having finance at the table from the outset alongside a technical solution ensures that projects actually get delivered. The amount of times I've had propositions come to me that were cooked up by an energy service company and their client that looked very well between the two of them, but where the risk allocation was such that it was just impossible to fund, and therefore projects just falling over. So having finance at the table from the outset, we think is particularly important. The second key thing I want to highlight here is this is independent of any specific technical solution or indeed energy supplier. Most of these arrangements sit seamlessly alongside existing supply arrangements, so it's independent of any technology provider or energy supplier. The third element, which I just want to stress, is that these arrangements are set up to be performance-driven. So we only get paid if we deliver those savings or if we deliver the energy from the battery. And then finally, we're finding in discussions with a lot of these multinationals, they are looking for an international, a global solution. And on the Macquarie platform, this is something we can now very much do. So in summary, we are seeing significant changes in the energy market, which I think will require for the audience here today perhaps some thinking about how to future-proof either existing buildings or how one thinks about developing some of the property assets going forward. But I suppose the good news is that there are funding mechanisms to help you navigate that transition. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.